Alright ladies, so this is the first of two videos that will cover the remaining notes for our Unit 2 on biochemistry. I split it into two videos so that hopefully maybe each one is a little more bearable to just sit down and watch in one sitting. But you want to watch both of them to fill in the rest of your notes. Now we talked about enzymes some already, but what we didn't talk about is just proteins in general. And so I want to take a few minutes to do that. Proteins are really abundant, so they are everywhere. They are important to every living organism that we know of. And the primary reason that they're so prevalent is because they're the major structural component, like you see here, of every living cell. The majority of sort of like solid structures in an organism are made up of protein. So a lot of the cell structure is protein. Your hair and nails are entirely protein. Your muscles are mostly protein. Your bones are mostly protein. I don't know if mostly, but a lot of protein. So your structure is primarily proteins, and the major job of a protein then is generally structural. Proteins can also be messengers or receptors to allow cells to communicate with each other. Proteins, we will see this year, also will help you fight disease. So a lot of proteins are involved in the immune system. And then one of the most important things that you have proteins for is to serve as enzymes, which we've already now looked at in class and in the lab. A protein is also an organic molecule, so it's made out of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. But it also includes nitrogen in every single protein, and a lot of times it includes sulfur. So an alternative name for proteins is polypeptides. But every protein is built from smaller units called amino acids. So if your house was a protein, then all of the bricks that we use to build the house would be the amino acids. Every amino acid has a general structure, like you see right here. Every single one of them is going to have a central carbon in the middle. On one side, it's going to have an amino group, which is an NH2 molecule. On the other side, it's going to have a carboxylic acid group, COOH. On the third side, they will always have a single hydrogen, and then the fourth side is known as the variable group. And if you're looking at different amino acids, the reason they're different is because of the variable group. So every amino acid has an amino group, an acid group, and a hydrogen, and then each one will differ based on the variable group. And if you look at this, you can see where the name comes from now, right? Amino acid. Now, there are 20 naturally occurring amino acids around us. There are others that are synthetic, they're man-made, but there's 20 that occur naturally in living systems. This picture is different than the one that's on your notes. The one that you'll see on your notes is sort of a mocked-up one that was never really finalized, that was going to go into the textbook that Dr. Wong and I worked on. So I replaced it in these official notes this year with one I found on the internet here. That shows you the 20 different amino acids. And I do not want you to memorize this table, okay? As this is here, you do not need to know these structures. I just wanted you to kind of see them. Remember, anywhere that there's a corner, it's actually a carbon molecule here, or carbon atom. And I just wanted you to see that there's a lot of different structures, and they can have all kinds of different characteristics. They can be very small, they can be hydrophobic or hydrophilic, they can be acidic or basic, they can be aromatic, which is what you call it if it has this kind of ring structure in it. So they come in all different types. But please don't try to memorize these structures or anything. But look what I want you to notice. The bottom of every one of them is exactly the same. Right? It's a central carbon, it's an amino group, a carboxylic acid group, a hydrogen, and then in this picture, moving upwards, is that R group. So the top part of every one of these should look different if you look at the different amino acids. Now, 12 of the amino acids can be made by our bodies. So your body can make it, no problem. The other 8 you can only obtain through consumption, by eating them. So in other words, your body cannot make those other 8. and we call those the essential amino acids. So the other 8 amino acids you have to have in your diet, so they are essential in your diet. Now what you do need to know is the handout that I gave you in class. You should recognize the 20 names. You should know the 3-letter abbreviation that goes with each one. And you should know which 12 are non-essential and which 8 are essential. But please do not try to learn this picture right here. Now, 2 amino acids can come together, form a chemical bond that we call a peptide bond. The peptide bond basically goes from the amino group of one amino acid and attaches to the carboxylic acid group of the other amino acid. Then we can put these guys together, though, these single amino acids, we can put together in chains that are extremely long. So like it says here, a normal protein is really probably somewhere between 50 and 3,000 amino acids. And notice that a peptide bond forms through a dehydration synthesis reaction, like we've been talking about in other things here. So you notice that we'll take out water, here they have highlighted, and bond this thing together. So a peptide bond is formed by dehydration synthesis. Now, one of the trickier things about proteins is they have 4 levels of organization. This is basically just different layers of detail in terms of their shapes. So, primary structure. Primary structure is just the sequence of amino acids. So if we say that a certain protein is glycine attached to another glycine, attached to asparagine, attached to phenylalanine, that would be an example of its primary structure. What are the specific amino acids that we use to build it? Secondary structure is where the amino acids start to fold or twist around each other in very simple, consistent structures. So there's really 2 secondary structures that we look for. One is called an alpha helix, and another one is called a beta sheet. Alpha helix is like a twist. Beta sheet kind of looks like an accordion kind of shape. And so these are just common. We see these a lot, and this is very basic folding or twisting to start with. Then we get up to tertiary structure. So that's our 3rd level. And tertiary structure is where we combine all these secondary structures together to make a complex, specific shape to our protein. So at this point, our protein might be this wadded up, folded thing, but that is the specific shape of that specific protein. Now, the last thing is quaternary structure, and actually all proteins do not have quaternary structure. Some of them just reach the tertiary stage and that's it. If the protein needs to attach to other proteins, so combined tertiary shapes, so if the protein needs to attach to other proteins to be functional, then we say that it has quaternary structure. So for instance, we'll see a few times this year, hemoglobin. We mentioned it back when we talked about the A1C test for diabetes. Hemoglobin has 4 subunits. So each one of those has a tertiary structure, but the protein hemoglobin is not functional until 4 of those come together, and that's what we would call a quaternary structure. Now, all the way at the bottom here, primary structure, the sequence of amino acids determines the protein's 3D shape, and the shape determines the function. Structure and function. Shape is so important. We talked a little bit about how an enzyme has to be the right shape. Any kind of protein has to be the right shape. So if any level of structure here gets messed up, the protein is not going to function anymore. Now here are some pictures of this. Again, primary structure is just your sequence of amino acids. Secondary structure, here's an example of a beta sheet and an alpha helix. We twist these guys all together to form a specific tertiary structure, and then notice the 4 different colors here. If the protein or several polypeptides have to come together, then we would call that quaternary structure. Now, the most important function of proteins, I would say, is as enzymes, because you won't get chemical reactions in your cells without these enzymes. They're also really important for signaling. Like I said on that early slide here in this video, allowing different cells to communicate with different cells, maybe across very distant parts of your body. So proteins are also really important for that communication aspect. Also, don't forget that they're just super important based on structure, right? You need these in your body for structural reasons. That leads us quickly to two types of proteins, kind of in general. And those two types are fibrous versus globular. Now, what's cool is these are exactly what they sound like. Right? Fibrous proteins are fiber-like. They're usually a twisted kind of rope-looking thing. Whereas globular proteins are exactly what they sound like. They're shaped like this. Right? They're just a mess. They're globs. And so when we look at all the proteins in the body, generally they will fall into either the fibrous type or the globular type. Now, in terms of your diet, right, common sources of protein would include meats, which is basically just muscle. Milk is high in protein. Nuts are very high in protein, but also fat. Egg whites are entirely protein. And fish are also a great source of protein. And there's many others too, but those would just be a few of the dietary ways you can get proteins. Now that takes us to lipids. Lipids are also made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So they are the third organic big biomolecule. And lipids are primarily used for storage of energy. I didn't mean to cross that out. That's important. Storage of energy. When we look at carbohydrates, they are there as a good source of energy, but lipids are there to help you store energy. Now, also, as we'll get into a little bit later this year, lipids are essential for your membrane structure, so you got to have them for cell structure as well. But the big thing in the body is that they help you store energy. And although we're kind of trained at a very young age to think about fats as being bad, right? You should have a low-fat diet and all that good stuff. While that's kind of true, you have to have fats, right? We're sort of conditioned to think of fat in our diets as a bad thing. But you have to have a small amount of fat. You need it for those membranes. You need it for other purposes as well. That said, they do recommend that fats should make up 30% or less of your total caloric daily intake. Right? So you do want a lower fat diet because fats shouldn't be more than 30% of your diet. If you have, let's say, 15% fat in your diet, that's probably enough to keep you really healthy. So and there's also bad consequences for too much fat. So the less fat, usually the better, but you do need some. Now, when we look at a fat, a basic simple fat is called a triglyceride, as pictured here. A triglyceride, like it sounds, has 3 pieces to it, and those are 3 fatty acid chains. And each of those fatty acid chains are attached to a glycerol backbone. So we call this a triglyceride. 3 chains attached to a glycerol backbone. Now, different lipids have different properties, and that has to do with their structure. So if we look at length first, right, fatty acid chains have different lengths of carbon and hydrogen. Usually they range from 16 to 18 carbons in length, but they can be shorter and they can be longer. The length sort of varies with the amount of energy that the fat is storing, but it's not like a perfect connection either, so you don't have to know that short ones are less energy or anything like that. The other big characteristic is saturation. If you look at this picture over here, if all of our carbons in our chain are joined by single bonds and then are otherwise covered in hydrogen, we say that is a saturated fat, and that term is coming from the fact that it's saturated by hydrogen. If any of the carbons are attached by a double bond, and therefore not as saturated with hydrogen, we would say that is an unsaturated fat. Now, saturated fats can stack up nicely one after the other because they are these straight chains. Unsaturated fats, as you see here, sort of have a kink to them, so they are not as likely to stack together as well. Now, that stacking ability, or lack thereof, is what gives you some of the big characteristics of these types of fat. So saturated fats, because they can stack so nicely on each other, generally are seen as solid at room temperature. And these are usually animal-based fats. So things like butter and lard and cream and dairy products, those are going to be saturated fats. Unsaturated fats are usually liquids at room temperature because of this kinked structure. They don't stack on each other, so they don't really form a solid, but they're found in a liquid. These are usually plant-based, and these are the oils, right? So olive oil, vegetable oil, peanut oil, canola oil, these oils are usually going to be derived from plants. And some people say that these are better for you. Your body is more likely to digest fully and excrete unsaturated fats, whereas it will tend to store saturated fats more. So if you have a diet where most of your fats are unsaturated, you're less likely to gain weight, and that's probably better as well for your cardiovascular system, your heart and blood vessels and things. Now, I do want to bring up trans fats. Notice that trans fats are just a specific example of an unsaturated fat, but you probably heard that trans fats are just terrible for you, like you should avoid those, and a lot of food products now even advertise on the packaging that this is trans fat free. Now, I don't want to get too into this because it's a lot of chemistry, but your body has an enzyme called lipase. And lipase breaks down lipids. Now, lipase, like other enzymes, is specific to a reaction, and it has a specific shape itself, and it has a specific shape that it likes to work on. And it works on a fat that has a cis structure. So if you eat a fat that has a cis structure, which this is really oversimplified, but this would be an example of like a cis chemical structure. Notice that the kind of parts of it are all on the same line of a certain plane. If you eat something with a cis structure, lipase breaks it down and you're good to go. But if you eat something with a trans double bonded structure, it would look something more like this. So this is what trans would look like. Now notice a trans fat has parts that lie like on either side of a plane. What happens is if a food corporation takes a saturated fat and tries to unsaturate it to use it in its cooking. So let's say it takes some solid lard and it melts it down, or it chemically changes it to become unsaturated, so then it can use it to like fry the potato chips or French fries, which, by the way, McDonald's fries are now trans fat free. But let's say you're frying those things in some fats that you rendered down and made unsaturated. Natural unsaturated fats look like this, and your body breaks them down. If you chemically synthesize saturated fats, they'll look like this. And your enzyme cannot break down. Now, as we already said, you have to have lipids. They are necessary. So why? The example we had is the main reason to have fats is for energy storage. Fats store your energy way more efficiently than carbohydrates. You might recall that carbs can be stored as glycogen in your muscle and liver, but that's not a real efficient storage form. So if we use fat, the basic fat structure, which has more hydrogen and less oxygen than a carbohydrate, is just chemically better at storing energy, basically per gram. So you can have more energy stored on your body with a lot less fat stored there than you would need the amount of carbohydrates to be stored there. So when we're talking about long-term storage, maybe for a wild animal that would hibernate, or just for you guys if you find yourself in a starving condition, you're better off storing that energy as fats. Now, a couple years ago, I had a student ask me, which they were a little embarrassed, I think, to even say it, but they said, shouldn't fat people have more energy then than healthy people? And what they were thinking of is energy like your case study talks about, energy like moving around, running around, being hyper or whatever. And the answer is no, right? But if we talk about it from a totally biochemical standpoint, yes. Someone who's overweight and carrying more fat molecules does have more energy on their body than someone who weighs less. The problem is they have a lot heavier body to move around, and it's going to take them a lot more energy to do stuff than it takes a thin person. So over time, they're going to feel worn out because they're expending so much energy just to move around. Now, the other really big necessity for lipids is your membranes. You got to have waterproof barriers on the outside of your cell, and also surrounding certain parts of the cell. So we'll go into this a lot more later, but there are phospholipids, which have a head and two tails, two fatty acid tails. The head includes a phosphate group, hence the name phospholipid. And these guys have a hydrophilic head that likes water, but the more important part is they have hydrophobic tails. So they go together to form a membrane barrier on the outside of your cells. And we'll talk about this a lot more in our next unit. Now, the last thing I want to talk about here with lipids, and it also has a good medical tie-in, is cholesterol. Cholesterol is a very special lipid, as you see here. It has a very unique shape. It's not just a triglyceride. But cholesterol is what we call a steroid. So you do have steroids in your own body that your body makes. So this is a steroid structure, but it is a lipid. Cholesterol is critical for the production of hormones. So your steroid hormones like testosterone and estrogen are derived from cholesterol. And you also need cholesterol in your membranes to help maintain their fluid kind of structure. So it maintains fluidity of the membrane. So cholesterol you have to have, right? Now, the thing is, the FDA has said that your body makes enough cholesterol on its own, meaning that your diet does not require cholesterol at all. And yet lots of our foods are high in cholesterol. So what we see today in America is an epidemic of high cholesterol, or sometimes called hypercholesterolemia, which is a mouthful, because our diet has it. Any kind of red meat has a lot of cholesterol to it, from like if you've eaten beef or something like that, and also anything that's preserved, so any kind of frozen foods. If you check out even the supposedly healthy ones, like a lean cuisine frozen meal, check out the info on it sometimes. It's going to have a fair amount of cholesterol in it. So the less cholesterol you eat, the better. And the reason is because too much cholesterol can help clog your blood vessels. Leads to blood clots, which then if those move to your heart, you can have a heart attack. If a clot occurs in your brain, that would be a stroke. And other cardiovascular problems too, like increased blood pressure, can all result from too much cholesterol in the body. Now here's a picture of what goes on if your cholesterol levels are maintained at a high level. What happens is the cholesterol actually deposits in the lining of your arteries. So not out in the opening here itself, but instead it actually deposits in the wall. And so what happens is the opening of your blood vessel starts to narrow. So again, it's not that the cholesterol itself is a clot or a clump in your vessel. It's just that the wall builds up this plaque, we call it plaque, and you end up with a medical condition called atherosclerosis. Sclerosis means hardening. So what happens is these cholesterol plaques build up. Your blood vessels harden, which is not good. You want flexibility in your vessels. And the lumen, or the opening of the vessel, gets narrowed. Now, when that opening gets narrowed, it is much more likely to form a clot with different components of your blood. And then if you get a clot, you could block blood flow to a certain part of your body, which is really, really bad. And in certain places, it's even worse. So if you block blood flow to your heart, that's a heart attack. Blood flow to your brain, that's a stroke. And we call the result ischemia. Ischemia essentially means lack of blood flow. And therefore, lack of oxygen. Right? So if you don't get oxygen to a tissue, it's going to become ischemic, and that tissue can die. Now, this is near and dear to my heart. High cholesterol runs in my family. High cholesterol is actually a genetic condition. So when I was 19 years old, I went to the doctor. I was having some random things, just didn't feel real good. One of the tests they ran was a blood test for cholesterol, which I had never had before I was 19, and my cholesterol came back terrible. Now, unlike a lot of other college freshmen, my diet was actually pretty good. I exercised a lot. I was very active playing tennis and basketball. So I was not the candidate you would expect, a 19-year-old male who was quite thin and active and didn't have the worst diet in the world. But sometimes genetically we just have high cholesterol. And so what you have to do in that case is you got to watch your diet. And a lot of times you have to take medicine, which is what I do. Now, there are two types of cholesterol in the body, and both of them are necessary, but they are necessary only in a certain kind of level or balance. So you've got two kinds here. You've got HDL and LDL. This stands for high density lipoprotein and then low density lipoprotein. All right, for the other one. So high density lipoprotein and low density lipoprotein. You may have heard before good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. It's because you do want good cholesterol. You actually need some LDL as well, but it's not as critical for your health. And so when we look at someone, they're always going to have a value for HDL or LDL in a blood test, but we're looking for those to be in the right balance. So everybody's cholesterol, so kind of like we did with diabetes, if we look at this from a lab perspective, your cholesterol, so I'm going to put COL, should be under 200. And that's, I think, milligrams per deciliter, but don't worry about that. Just note the number. All right, so your cholesterol should be under 200, and that is your total cholesterol. Then if we look at somebody for their optimum numbers, we should see an HDL greater than 60, and we should see an LDL less than 100. So if we see somebody with a cholesterol under 200, we don't automatically say that their cholesterol is good. Because if their under 200 is mostly LDL, that's not a good thing either. So we definitely look at total cholesterol. If your total cholesterol is over 200, that's a concern. But we also want to look at what is your balance of HDL to LDL, your ratio there. And so we want HDL to be higher. Things like exercising will raise your HDL. And things like terrible diet will raise your LDL. So if you eat well and you exercise, you keep those things in a good balance, and you don't have to worry about this whole blood clotting or blood vessel closing up issue. Now, like I said, a lot of frozen foods, egg yolks, red meats, so beef, are all high in cholesterol. And the problem is that a lot of the fats you eat, other kinds of fat, will also be turned into cholesterol by your body. So if you can have a diet with no cholesterol, that's the best thing. Now, I'm going to try to make a little space here. One other thing I want you to know is how we treat someone who has high cholesterol. So if diet and exercise doesn't help, which is what I went through when I was in college, then we have to give these people medications. The main type of medication that we use is called a statin drug. You've probably heard of Lipitor or maybe Crestor on TV before. These are the name brands for statins. What statins do is they decrease your body's generation of cholesterol. I know it's really hard to read my handwriting. So statin drugs decrease your body's generation or creation of cholesterol. So that way, if you eat some in your diet, it's not as big of a deal because your body isn't making as much on its own. Now, another option, which are a lot less common, are called absorption inhibitors. And these stop you from absorbing cholesterol when you eat it. So if you eat something high in cholesterol, the cholesterol won't get absorbed into your bloodstream. You'll just poop it back out. The problem, as you might guess if you think about it too much, is these absorption inhibitors will tend to cause diarrhea because it leaves a lot of fat in your digestive tube. So statins are usually used more successfully, and that's actually what I take. I take Crestor. But they're really effective, and a lot of people are on them. But they can keep you from having this blood vessel problem, so it's a good thing. Okay, so that takes care of the first video, proteins and lipids. Now we move on to nucleic acids and just a little commentary about nutrition.